the Institute for the Study of Peak States presents the second International Psychoimmunology and Psychobiology Research Symposium. Easy ways to access peak experiences and peak states in modern life. Presented by Gilli Moorhawk.
So for our next presentation, Gilli Moorhawk is got an MA, is a health researcher, author, and EFT practitioner with a special interest in infertility and birth trauma, and also runs workshops on the benefits of becoming embodied. Gilli's forthcoming book, Becoming the Sexual Athlete with Don Dura, will be published later this year. And she's here to talk about peak states and peak experiences. So welcome, Gilli.
Good morning, everybody. Morning, afternoon, and evening, I think it is. I'm just going to share the screen because I've got a lot of slides to do here. So let's just do that. So I started learning about peak states with the ISPS in 2013, and I've been fascinated by this subject ever since. I wanted to share some of the things I've learned from other areas and hopefully give you some ideas about how you can improve your chances of getting one or more of them. So this is there we go. This is an outline of what we're going to go through today. What are peak experiences and peak states? My story, traditional routes to peak experiences and peak states, which is yoga, martial arts, and meditation, horses and the herd, sexuality, and can we facilitate peak experiences and peak states, and successful, suggested helpful trainings. So let's just start with what are peak states. One simple way to define a peak state is a fairly permanent state of better than normal functioning. A peak experience is having this for a shorter period of time. Another way of looking at it is having a peak state means that people have a higher level of functioning, which is more pleasant than normal consciousness. A peak state could be described as a more positive emotional state, for an example, a continuous state of peace or joy or happiness. But not all peak states are emotional. They can be physical, like feeling that the body is hollow or has golden light inside or feels sacred. Peak states can be mental, like suddenly having perfect understanding of complex subjects beyond your normal ability. And they can be spiritual, like knowing God, communicating with God, or even becoming God. So why is this so important? Well, apart from giving us more pleasant states of consciousness, peace and happiness rather than anxiety and depression, Abraham Maslow found that even having temporary peak experience makes people more likely to reach the higher levels of adult development. Additional research done in 2012 took this further and noted that people who had peak experiences were more likely to make ethical and empathetic decisions. Certainly, man has been searching for these higher states of consciousness for thousands of years, and there are a variety of techniques that have been around for that length of time to facilitate them. My exposure to peak states started in 2012 with a dog called Whiskey. He's a Frankenstein dog, a bit of a collie, a bit of a Labrador, a bit of a Basset hound, mixed in with something else. But it wasn't his strange looks that appealed to me so much. It was his endlessly cheerful demeanor. In peak states parlance, we'd say he had inner peace, underlying happiness, and being love. This definitely wasn't my state of consciousness at that time. If a bigger dog snapped at Whiskey on our walks, he would snap or cower back, and his tail would go down and his smile would go. But then as soon as we passed the other dog, he'd be back to normal, all cheerful, trotting along, tail in the air with a big smile on his face. And I thought how different it would be if a dog attacked a human. Can you imagine? The human would go home and tell everybody, this dog did this to me. Oh my goodness, this is what happened. It was terrible. And they'd tell the story to everybody they knew. And then they'd go to the police station, and then they'd file a complaint, and it would end up in court. And 6 months later, they would still be talking about that thing that happened with that dog on that day. Yet Whiskey had forgotten about his problems after 5 seconds. And I remember thinking, why can't humans be more dog? At that time, I thought it was impossible. And then I found out about peak states. So let's look at some of the traditional ways that people have used to gain these elusive states of consciousness. So since coming to the West, yoga has lost a great deal of its transformational power. For the most part in the West, yoga is now simply a relaxing physical exercise rather than a powerful transformational practice. A Western yoga teacher will choose the postures that they feel like doing on the day or follow a theme like stress or pregnancy. And people will attend a class maybe once, maybe twice a week. Compare this to learning yoga from a guru at an ashram. You are taught a particular sequence of practices, a combination of postures, breathwork, and meditation that must be done in the same order once or twice a day. The theory being that each part of the practice builds on the step before, building powerfully up to give maximum transformational benefit. People who follow the traditional yoga practices at the ashram I go to in India have described having these states: hollow state, inner peace, underlying happiness, golden inside, another life form, and reduced sleep. In the same way that yoga has been corrupted on its journey to the West, martial arts coming from China, Japan, and Korea have experienced a similar decline in standards. Many dojos in the West will be financially driven, where it's about producing as many black belts as possible and getting a good reputation. Traditional martial artists cynically call this MacDojo, like McDonald's, fast martial arts. So the quality of teaching and the quality of expertise in the student is much reduced from what it would be in the East, very sadly. So while a traditional martial artist in Japan may take 15 to 20 years to gain good states of consciousness, in the West, it would probably take 30 to 40 years or even longer to get to the same level. The kinds of peak states seen in the traditional martial arts teachers, men in their 80s and 90s, include void connection, loving kindness state. One of the teachers, who's 94, actually says that when he's fighting, he becomes love. Reduced sleep, being present, and wide-angle vision, which is of course very useful when you're dealing with attackers from both front and behind. Compared to yoga and martial arts, meditation is something that we're getting better at in the West, thanks to recent technological advances and better understanding of brain states. Using brain monitoring and neurofeedback, it's now possible to achieve in 6 months what a monk in a monastery might take 10 to 20 years to achieve. These brain gyms, the high-end ones, are much favored by Silicon Valley people. It costs $19,000 for a 7-day course, I believe. But this can give people access to really good states, flow states, creativity. So it's an investment. For those of us not quite so wealthy, guided meditations by people like Dr. Joe Vitale and Dr. Dawson Church are really accessible and make meditation much easier and much more beneficial for many people. The kinds of states that come from meditation include various forms of what different traditions call enlightenment, inner peace, and underlying happiness. So I've been around horses for most of my life. So when I found out that there were new therapeutic methods which involved working with horses, I signed up straight away. There are several horse-facilitated methods, including equine-facilitated learning, equine-facilitated psychotherapy, leadership training, and herd work. I did some leadership training, both one-on-one and in a group with a guy called Paul Hunting in Southwest England. I wasn't particularly interested in leadership, but I was very interested in working with the horses. Leadership training is usually undertaken by CEOs and people high up in major corporates, having problems with subordinate staff or with leading teams. Horse work is very powerful work, but it can also be very frustrating. I've seen grown men cry doing this because it's very difficult for someone who's used to getting everybody to do what he tells them to not be able to make a mere animal do what they're told. So during the session, we spent a couple of hours discussing my issues and setting goals for the session. And then with me champing at the bit, we went down to the paddock to work with Paul's two beautiful horses. What you have to understand is horses like to follow the leader. They don't like to lead. So if you can prove you have leadership skills, they will quite happily follow you. But leadership to a horse isn't about being senior or giving orders in a loud voice. It's much more subtle than that. It's more about demonstrating a certain embodied confidence. And it takes a while for us humans stuck in our heads to get to that. So imagine you're in a paddock with two big horses. You're a puny human weighing 160 to 200 pounds, and the horses are 1,000 to 1,200 pounds. You don't have a saddle or a bridle, no rope and no whip, and you have to persuade the horse to do what you want them to do. It is very challenging, but once you get it, it's quite amazing. By the end of the day, I had these two horses cantering around me in a circle, and it was completely exhilarating. Later, when I was driving home, I felt completely euphoric and felt I could take on the world. It was a wonderful state to be in. And later I discovered that this is the being on track state. The second time I worked with horses was herd work with a lady based in Wales, working with a herd of 27 horses. That was a very different experience. When you come to join the herd, it's about letting go of your individuality and following the herd mind. Being in your head and thinking isn't a safe position in the wild. If there's a predator in the woods, the horse runs first and asks questions later. So humans are a liability with their endless curiosity. To be accepted by the herd, you need to get out of your head and into your body. So these are some of the states that I've heard of from working with horses: being on track, herd mind, and being love. So what's the link between horses and Navy SEALs? Hollywood has a fascination with action films with Navy SEALs and special ops. So we probably think we know all about them. They are the strongest, toughest, and most dangerous combat soldiers in the world. They can run for 20 miles with a heavy pack on their back in the pitch dark without food and water for days and no weapons, and still overcome the enemy at the end of the journey with their bare hands. But according to this book, Stealing Fire, what the Marines are actually looking for when they train the SEALs and Special Ops is a particular peak state where the men can cast off their individuality and merge with the team and follow whoever needs to be the leader in that moment without speaking or obviously communicating. It's not a volitional thing. It's a subconscious thing. So this is why it costs so much, because only about 20% of the Marines who are trained can actually access this peak state. And those who fail are sadly often broken by the training. So this was just a way to show that humans can access this kind of herd state just as much as herds of horses or flocks of geese or shoals of fish. The next area I investigated was sex. So when I talk to people about sensuality, spirituality, sexuality, and the kinds of states that you can get from sexual activity, they all say to me, so if you can get peak states from sex, how come everybody doesn't have them? So the peak states training that I come across is like running a marathon. The normal 10 or 20 minutes of sexual activity isn't intense enough. It's something that you have to train for, and the training is for long duration penetration. Over a period of time, it's possible to increase your penetration control by 50%, 100%, even 500%, so that you can last for an hour or 2 hours or even longer. And at the upper limits of time, miracles do happen. Stuart Savatsky, in his book Advanced Spiritual Intimacy, says these things start to happen after the second hour of embrace. And that was certainly true for me. The other things that are really important are trust, safety, and emotional connection. On the whole, these states are going to come in connection with what Tantra calls the beloved, seeing the god or goddess in one's partner. However, other researchers have noted that similarly expanded states can arise spontaneously in sex and can also be elicited by BDSM, bondage, dominance, submission, and masochism. The states that you can access sexually include hollow state, gold and white inside, and god and goddess state. A friend of mine became Shiva after a 9-hour lovemaking session with his girlfriend, and becoming love or loving kindness state was another thing that he had experienced. So another interesting state I had in a sexual context was a state of left brain shutdown. There's a lot of research going on into left hemisphere dominance, and researchers are investigating what happens when the left brain is switched off and the right brain takes over. I didn't have a name for it until I found references to similar states in other books. For me, it was just a very Zen state, very peaceful, with a quiet mind. Not much thinking, but I couldn't talk for 24 hours. In fact, I only started talking because I forced myself to talk because I needed to go out and talk with some people. The problem, of course, of being in some of these states is you're not in a place where you can really assess or analyze or even really remember what was going on, because that's left brain function. This is an excellent book by neuroscientist Jill Bolte-Taylor, who talked about her experiences of having a stroke to the left side of her brain when she was 37, which returned her to a completely infantile state. She lost the ability to speak, to talk, to walk, to feed herself, and it took 7 years to recover. Her TED talk is excellent if you haven't seen it. Jill describes how the left side of her brain was shut down and the right side of the brain opened her up to a whole expanded awareness where she felt at one with everything. She could sense the emotions of the people around her, sense things that were going on in the room, and felt like her awareness expanded outside her body and filled the room. She said that when her left brain healed and she came back online, she was actually very sad to lose that lovely state that she'd had. And one of the authors of The Return to the Brain of Eden, Tony Wright, frequently practices long periods of sleep deprivation, up to 11 days. And he says that one time, after about 80 hours of staying awake, the left hemisphere of his brain switched off, leaving the right side of the brain wide awake. He also entered a very religiously peaceful state with the inability to speak, but his state only lasted 20 minutes before the left brain kicked in again. So personally, I think gaining this state from sexual activity is a lot more efficient and certainly a lot more fun. So is there anything we can do to facilitate accessing peak experiences and peak states? Definitely a daily yoga, martial arts, or meditation practice. Clearing out all trauma. The Institute states that most of our peak states are inhibited by the trauma we had at birth and during our early life. And using things like peak states therapy, EFT, and other psychological power therapies will help you to clear this trauma quicker than it used to be. Embodiment is another thing that I'm kind of big on. In most people, the center of self or the center of awareness is about the size of a tennis ball in the head, whereas the sense of awareness or the sense of self in a small child fills their whole body. So I'm very big on helping people to get back into their body, because this is how you can feel the stuff that's going on. We're all so much stuck in our heads, especially now with phones and computers, and really much out of touch with our bodies. And finally, grounding. This is only since the 60s have we stopped being in contact with the earth. That was when rubber-soled and plastic-soled shoes first went into production. Before that, people had worn shoes made of leather for millennia, and that allowed us to connect with the earth. So putting your feet on the bare ground as much as possible is another big thing. Some training possibilities to investigate. This is a yoga practice that I do that's taught by a yogi called Sadhguru in India. He's very well known in India and also in the West now with his YouTube channel. It's a 4-day training, 21-minute practice, benefits in 45 to 90 days, and it's taught online. This book, The Finders, by Dr. Jeffrey Martin, was recommended to me by Dan Zeiss, who did a presentation yesterday. The Finders course is really interesting. They've identified 4 different, very individual states, and he's developed a program on the basis of all his research, which makes approximately 70% of participants awaken in 1 to 14 weeks. It's taught online and it's scientifically validated. And finally, Buteyko breathing is something that I found really fascinating. Some of you may be aware of this as a treatment for asthma, but it's actually a lot more powerful and profound in its impact. People have noticed over the years that as people get closer to death, they breathe more frequently and more deeply, while people who are higher functioning may only take 3 or 4 breaths a minute, compared to the 12 to 15 to 20, which is normal in Westerners. When I read the books, they talked about how when you get to a certain level of breathing, you will love exercise, which I thought was quite impossible for me. I hate exercise. I would rather sit in a chair with a book and a bowl of ice cream than go walking or running. But after doing the breathing exercises for several weeks, I woke up one day with a feeling of euphoria and a longing to exercise. This was a human being more dog. It only happened once, unfortunately, but it was a really powerful indicator of how good this technique is. So I always recommend that people investigate it. So in conclusion, this is a very brief look to find some ways to access peak experiences and peak states. Because if you have a peak experience, it's possible using the ISPS proprietary technique in some cases to convert it to a peak state. My list is by no means exhaustive. I haven't even mentioned dancing or chanting or psychedelics like LSD or sacred medicines like ayahuasca, San Pedro, and magic mushrooms, or the many other ways that we clever humans have found to hack our brains over the last million years. This is a huge field, and there are so many new practices out there. It's certainly something I will continue to research. And if you like, I'll come back next year with any new and exciting discoveries. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. That was great. Lots of great information, definitely delivered in a very entertaining way as well at times. Just checking to see if we've got any questions. So there's one here, someone that's either read some of our books or been to some of our trainings. The left brain shutdown state, is that a shutdown of one of the triune brains or something else in the primary cell? Have you done any research around that?
I'm not sure, because it's only one part of the brain. It could be, yes, the left side of the mind brain shutting down. There's a lot of research showing that the left brain seems to inhibit the better functioning right brain, and people aren't really sure why that happens, but it's a very interesting area.
Okay. So got a question here from Antonella. Is herd peak state safe in humans at this stage? Because herd mentality doesn't seem to be.
Yeah. Well, you know, maybe some of the kind of the mass protests and things, maybe people are falling into herd state. You're right. It could be a kind of a risky thing. The seals seem to train for it, so they're used to using it, and they can slip in and out of it as required. But you're right. Random people just dropping into herd state in a crowd. Yeah. Heaven only knows what they might do.
Mm-hmm. And another question from Antonella was around what are the peak states that people in the Finders course achieve? Do you know, is there?
It's interesting actually, because they have a very different way of defining their states, because it's like a cluster of states.
Mm-hmm.
So there are 4 levels in the Finder state, and people can go between 1, 2, 3, and 4, and there are higher levels, but so few people are in it, they haven't been able to research. So in the level 1 state, there's a feeling of a real feeling of ease. There's loss of fear of death, and there was one other aspect. Sorry, I can't remember. Whereas the 3rd level is just the person becomes, I think the person kind of becomes love, and then everybody just wants to hang out with them. So it's a very different dynamic from the first and third. The first and the third were the 2 I was most interested in.
Yeah.
But I haven't done that yet, but I probably will.
Right, yeah, great. Well, thank you so much. I'm sure people will be interested in you being back again next year if you've got some more stuff to teach us. So let's get ready for our next presenter.
Thank you for watching. For more information, visit peakstates.com.